Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to MusicForever, where today I'm going to be reviewing the newest album from Run the Jewels, RTJ4. This was a project that I was looking forward to a lot because I'm a pretty big fan of Run the Jewels. I love all three albums that they've already put out before this one. In fact, I'd even go as far as to say that Run the Jewels 2 is one of my favorite records of the last decade. And coming into this new album here, I was just excited to see what these guys want to do. Were they going to continue to expand on some of the ideas that they introduced in Run the Jewels 3? Were they going to bring in some other new ideas? Were they going to just continue on with some of the same stuff that I already enjoyed? And the answer to that question is a little bit of all three, really. Run the Jewels 4 is a project that feels very much like a Run the Jewels project. It has all of those things you've come to expect from these guys at this point, but at the same time, it introduces just enough new stuff to keep things interesting, and the presentation of all the ideas here is still really entertaining and engaging and pleasant to listen to. You have a nice mix on this project of energetic, upbeat bangers. You have some more political, introspective cuts. You have some more personal cuts on this thing as well. Stuff that, as I said before, you've already gotten to some extent on previous Run the Jewels projects. However, again, I think that they're able to take these ideas and reinterpret them and reuse them in ways that I find to be really interesting and sprinkle in just enough new ideas too to keep these tracks feeling fresh and interesting. The rapping here on this project is fantastic, though of course that's to be expected given that Killer Mike and LP are two of the best rappers out there right now. But one thing I do want to shout out is just how the chemistry between the two here on this project continues to improve from Run the Jewels 3. I've always felt like the two have had really good chemistry, but there's a noticeable difference, I feel, from project to project as the group has gone on. I feel like their chemistry has improved, and I love how on this project, the way they mix together their verses and their bars, it just feels so much more natural too. It just feels like these two are, connected in the sense of being a rap duo in a way that they weren't, like, say, on the first Run the Jewels project, for example. I feel like they had good chemistry on that project, but it's nowhere near on the same level as what they're doing here on the fourth. And of course, despite the fact that both of them fit together so nicely here on this project, I love the fact that each of them have their own distinct personality as well when it comes to how they flow, how they rap, and just the kind of stuff that they talk about in their lyrics too. The production here on this project is also what you would pretty much expect from Run the Jewels at this point. LP's production here is pretty great. The same kind of beats and production that you've been hearing on the last few Run the Jewels releases. And it still works really nicely here on this project, especially when you take into account some of those new ideas I mentioned earlier that get mixed into some of these tracks. It just leads to some of these songs sounding very interesting and engaging. For example, you have a few tracks on this thing like the fourth song or the song Walking in the Snow, which have some beat switch-ups that are pretty cool. Regardless of how the beats are switching up and what they sound like, I think they fit the tracks really nicely and they just sound really awesome on their own as well. And of course you have the closing track to this thing too, A Few Words for the Firing Squad, which is one of the best tracks on the record and a multi-part song as well. It's kind of reminiscent, I feel, of the last track off their last record, which is also a lengthy multi-part song that was also a closer. But whereas that song kind of had two separate halves to it, I feel like the structure of this track here is a bit more linear. It starts off like a more typical Run the Jewels song before transitioning into this piece of jazzy instrumentation, which sounds really nice, before transitioning again into this kind of I guess the best way to describe it would be like a show outro, like a TV show outro, for example, for the album. It's very unique sounding and very cool too. So overall, the closing track to this thing is just very interesting structurally and just one of the best moments on this project, as I said before. In addition to this, some of the other most interesting moments on the record come as a result of some of the featured artists on this project. Run the Jewels do a good job at not only getting some artists that fit their sound really nicely, but also getting some artists that you wouldn't really typically expect to pop up on a Run the Jewels project, but they end up adding a lot of personality and fitting in quite nicely too. For example, the track Out of Sight that comes towards the start of this project begins like a typical Run the Jewels banger does, with a really great driving instrumental to it and some great rapping from both Killer Mike and LP. However, towards the end of this track, we have a feature from 2 Chainz, which is a rapper that I didn't really expect to appear on a Run the Jewels track, and I think he does a great job of actually blending in with this track, even though both his typical sound and the Run the Jewels typical sound aren't really the same. They do a good job when they cross over. I feel like 2 Chainz's flow on this track is really icy, really cold, pairs up nicely with LP's instrumental here, which is also kind of icy and cold as well. I think that some of 2 Chainz's wordplay and his verse is really great too. He just fits the track really nicely. You know, I didn't expect to hear 2 Chainz over LP production, but now that I've heard it, I kind of want to hear more of it, honestly. They pair up a lot more nicely than I was expecting. The track Pulling the Pin is another really interesting moment on this project from a sonic standpoint. It's a bit of a sadder, slower track on this thing, and while Run the Jewels have done tracks in this vein before, I think some of the features on this track really just add a little bit extra to this track to make it a bit more interesting. For example, you have Mavis Staples, who's providing some really great soulful vocals on the hook of this track, and you also have Josh Homme of Queens of the Stone Age popping up on this thing too to do some background vocals. Not a combination of artists I ever really expected to see come together, but it ends up working out quite nicely, especially considering I'm a pretty big fan of Queens of the Stone Age too. His backing vocals here on this track have this kind of dark, sinister sound to them. Kind of reminds me of some of his vocals, or background vocals on albums like Clockwork, or maybe even Lullabies the Paralyzed, for example, if you're familiar with those projects. I think he does a good job of adding to the atmosphere of this track really well without really detracting from what Killer Mike and LP are trying to accomplish. The track Just is another kind of interesting moment on this project too, sonically speaking. It has some pretty interesting features on it. You have a verse from Zach De La Rocha, who isn't a stranger to Run the Jewels tracks. This is his 3rd appearance on a Run the Jewels song now at this point, and he still has a really killer feature on this project. You also have Pharrell on this track doing the hook, which is also pretty cool too. But the most interesting thing about this track, I feel, is just the general sound of the instrumental of this thing. Really, it has this kind of bouncy feel to it that I don't feel like Run the Jewels have really tapped into all that much, but it plays out really nicely. I think Killer Mike, LP, and Zach do a good job of rapping over this instrumental, and Pharrell's hook sounds great over it too. Overall, while the sound of this project is one that you've already come to know and love on previous Run the Jewels projects, I still feel like the group does a good job of keeping it fresh and new and exciting on this project as well, between some of the track structures on this thing that are maybe a little bit different, some of the features that add some sound to this thing that are a bit unconventional for the group, or just the fact that a lot of these instrumentals are just really well produced and well put together as well. I love hard-hitting instrumentals on tracks like Out of Sight, or Yankee and the Brave, or on Walking in the Snow, regardless of which part of the track they're talking about. I feel like Walking in the Snow just constantly delivers a fantastic instrumental, honestly one of my favorite Run the Jewels instrumentals, period, regardless of which album you're talking about. The lyrics on this record, much like a lot of the instrumentals, are stuff that you've already come to know and expect from Run the Jewels at this point. You get that typical mixture of bragging, some political and socially charged lyrics, as well as some introspective stuff too. Nothing that on the surface seems super groundbreaking, but again, the group does just enough to keep things interesting here on this project, especially when it comes to some of the commentary that they provide for social and political issues on this thing. For example, on the track Walking in the Snow, the group has some of the best political commentary on the entire project, especially during Killer Mike's verse here on this track. I feel like his verse here really gets to the heart of a lot of different problems, and he's just able to get his point across so eloquently here in his verse. He talks about things like the education system and how it fails many kids, and focuses more on things like test scores as opposed to, actual worthwhile things. It talks about people being apathetic in today's political and cultural climate. It talks about police brutality and, things like that. Stuff that feels very relevant at the time of this album's release, given all the protests currently going on in favor of things like Black Lives Matter. It just feels like this song is a perfect track to accompany what's going on in the world right now. Somewhat unfortunately given the subject matter it's talking about, but at the same time, it's very important stuff that I feel like people need to hear. And the part that really hits hardest about Killer Mike's verse on this track is the fact that it was obviously written at some point in the past for this album, because obviously they weren't still writing the lyrics for this album as these events were going on. The album only dropped last week, so it just really proves how these issues or stuff has been going on for a while. It's not just some new thing or anything like that. He was able to really just pinpoint this exact issue that we're dealing with right now so perfectly at some point in the past, just because it's been going on for so long. It's been brought to the attention of a lot of people more recently, but it's something that Killer Mike's been talking about in his lyrics across his whole career, really, and I think on this track here, it's just one of his finest to date, really. Probably my favorite Killer Mike verse on any Run the Jewels project so far. The immediately following track just is another interesting moment on this project from a lyrical standpoint, talking about the issue of money and how money ties into things like corruption, for example, and how money causes problems and all of that stuff. I think that everyone involved with this track has a very interesting perspective to bring here, and I especially like Pharrell's hook of the track and how direct he is with his point, really, of how lots of, American dollar bills, for example, are loaded with pictures of slave masters, despite the fact that slavery is, supposed to be gone and all of that. He brings up that very obvious contradiction here, and it just does a really good job of setting the mood for what Killer Mike, LP, and Zach De La Rocha go into in far more detail in their verses. And now in a couple of closing tracks of this record, pulling the pin in a few words from the firing squad, the group is still talking about social and political issues, but at the same time they're putting a bit more of a personal twist on things as well, or at least a bit more of an obvious personal twist, I feel, because they're talking a bit more explicitly about their own personal lives and how those personal lives intertwine with some of the more political and social aspects of their lives too. I think it's a pretty interesting idea, and it ends off this album on a bit more of a personal note too, which I think is pretty appropriate considering that all of the Run the Jewel albums that preceded this one also kind of ended on kind of personal, more emotional moments too, and I feel like this album here is no exception. Throughout the rest of this album, you have lots of similar political and social topics touched upon individually in some other songs. Maybe not for the topic of the entire track, maybe it's just a short passage of lyrics talking about a particular topic or something like that. It's mixed in pretty nicely with everything else here on the project, as you would expect from Run the Jewels. Really, my only complaint when it comes to the lyrics here on this album is that maybe there are a few tracks on this thing that lyrically just aren't super standout or interesting when compared to some of the best moments on this project, either because they're doing a lot of the same stuff that the group has done on previous releases, or maybe not diving deeply enough or bringing enough of a new perspective to some topics that they've talked about before. Though even still, I think this is a pretty minor issue overall, especially when you consider the fact that the instrumentals and the flows and the features and really everything else about these songs happens to be fantastic too. The lyrics being maybe a bit typical for the group isn't exactly the worst thing in the world, and they still, there's nothing inherently wrong with them either at the same time. So overall, RTJ4 is a pretty great album in my opinion, and it's certainly a worthy successor of the three albums that preceded it. While the sound of this thing is very much in line with what you would expect from Run the Jewels at this point in their career, as I said at multiple points already in this review, the group does just enough to keep things interesting here on this project in order to keep you invested and engaged with this thing throughout its entire run. The instrumentals on this thing are fantastic, the flows here are fantastic too, lyrically this project is great as well, and there's many tracks on this thing where the group is tackling some pretty important subject matter, and I think they do a great job of getting across their message on said tracks. And there's just a lot of really interesting ideas packed into this thing too, between some of the track structures being kind of interesting, to some of the features being maybe a bit unconventional but still great sounding too. And of course you do have some typical features on this thing for the group too, like the beforehand mentioned Zach De La Rocha feature, which I really loved, as well as the Gangsta Boo feature on Walking in the Snow, which is just another fantastic aspect of that track. Overall, this is a pretty great project, and if you're a fan of Run the Jewels, if you like the previous three releases, I think you're definitely going to like this one as well. And if you haven't listened to Run the Jewels yet for whatever reason, and it sounds like it's something that might interest you, this is not a bad album to start with by any means. But yeah, overall, that sums up my thoughts on this project. If you happen to disagree, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave your own thoughts on this album in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you also leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, countdown lists, discussion videos, things of that sort. Again, thank you guys for watching, and stay golden.